We are up and running. Okay. Watch my cables here. Good evening, everyone. See you again for part 2, our discussion of Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. And again, just as a reinforcement, when we refer to Eretz Yisrael, when we talk about the land of Israel, we are talking about the land regardless of who is currently waving a flag over it. So Eretz Yisrael is eternal and has been eternal since the earth cooled. But Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, is always used as a reference to the modern state of Israel. Entity, if you will, rather than the geography. Obviously, they overlap. But for this discussion, we're still going to be focusing on the political side, not the earth and soil. Good? Good. All right, so when last we left our intrepid heroes, 1948 had come. Israel had declared independence according to the UN vote and had been attacked for its gumption. And we discussed the War of Independence in 48 and how Israel was able to survive and in some ways win that war, and in some ways even strengthened its position vis-a-vis what had been done in 48. This was not, however, a success. No. Success, yes, but there were repercussions. And some of those repercussions were to Jews who didn't live in Israel. That is to say, you may remember from our discussion last week that all of the different waves of aliyot, of the people coming to Israel and building it up in the 1800s, through the 1880s, and on into the 1900s, that all of that, oops, I think, you want to open up the youth lounge?
Sure. Yeah.
Here. If someone could pass along, there we are. It's the M key. Okay. All right. So you may remember that from all that discussion, where were most of those immigrants coming from? Europe, right? They were coming from Romania. They were coming from Russia. They were coming from Poland. They were mostly coming from Eastern Europe, some from Western Europe as well, some from the United States. But by and large, it was an Eastern European phenomenon for the bulk of the people who were coming. That began to change when the Nazis came into power, as we also discussed. But what you didn't see was huge migration of Jews coming from the other main center of Jewish population called the Middle East. Great, thank you. These Jews, known as the Sephardim, or did I unplug it? No, I'm just dancing around the cables. The Sephardim, or Mizrahi Jews, were not as involved in the Zionist program. Now, they did come, some, absolutely. They were not unrepresented, but they had relatively, that's qualified, stable communities in the countries of the Middle East, going all along the North Africa coast from Morocco through to Egypt, and all the way through in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, in Afghanistan, all the way through the Sinai Peninsula. There were Jewish communities, and these communities had been there for a long, long time. Many of them went back all the way to the Babylonian times. Others went back to the Roman times. Some were by the Spanish expulsion. That is to say, when the Jews left Spain and Portugal, many of them went to North Africa, the Middle East, and Turkey, and that whole area. And that's why many of the Jews who live there are called Sephardim, which means Spanish, even though they're not actually necessarily Spanish. So someone who lives in Tunisia can be called Sephardic, even though they don't speak Spanish. It's just one of those weird labels that we use. So those Jews had communities that were stable, that were not experiencing the same type of direct persecution that happened in Europe. And so most of them were not looking to leave yet. And that meant that when Israel became a country, there was a bit of a surprise. And that surprise was that the Arab and Muslim nations were not so friendly to the Jews who lived in their countries after Israel became a country. Right, now, that may shock you. I don't know how much you've paid attention, but a lot of people like to say that they are anti-Israel but they're not anti-Semitic, right? And technically, yes, that is a possible opinion for a person to have. But in practice, in the real world, most people who are anti-Israel also take it out on the local Jews. We saw this very recently in Scandinavia, where there was a firebombing of a synagogue, and they said this was because of President Trump's decision about Jerusalem. It's like, but the synagogue is not President Trump. The synagogue is not Israel. The synagogue are just local Jews that are just like you. I mean, they're not refugees, they're not foreigners. They have citizenship in your countries, and being anti-Israel very easily slips into being anti-Semitic, being anti-Jew. And we saw this very, very clearly following the War of Independence, where the Muslim nations all of a sudden decided that the Jews who lived in their countries, that were mostly second-class-ish citizens, were now going to be third class, fourth class, or pushed out altogether. And so you can see the population. In 1948, you have 250,000 Jews living in Morocco. It was a huge Jewish country. 1972, only 31,000 left, right? Look at another example, Algeria. We don't normally think of Algeria as being a big Jewish country. 140,000 Jews lived in Algeria in 1948. By 1972, only 1,000 were left, right? And you go down the list, I mean, Iraq, 135,000 to 500. There's some big drops here. As a matter of fact, across North Africa and the Arab countries, about 758,000 Jews were forced to leave those countries. And oftentimes were forced to leave with no money and no property. They were told you have to sell your house, but you have to sell your house by tomorrow, or you have to sell your house by next week. So that's not exactly a good way to sell your house. Or you're only allowed to leave with 2 suitcases, and the suitcases had to be inspected. You weren't allowed to carry too much cash. You weren't allowed to have jewels. And there were many restrictions on what the Jews in these countries could take with them when they were being forced to leave, or when they were being encouraged to leave. So left these countries and went to Israel with almost nothing. And that meant that Israel had to absorb about at least 750,000 Jews who were coming in. Now, some of them did not go to Israel. Some of them went to Europe. Some of them went to the United States. Some of them went to Latin America. But Israel, by and large, absorbed the majority of these Jewish refugees. And this was while they were also trying to absorb the refugees from Europe who were still there in 1948 after World War II, and were looking to rebuild their lives because many of their original homes in Poland and Romania and Czechoslovakia were A, behind the Iron Curtain, which wasn't really a nice place to live anymore, and B, were not exactly friendly to them anyway. So as much as those countries had also been conquered by the Germans, it turns out they were not necessarily friends of the Jews after the wars even still. So you end up with many, many people now coming into Israel right after the independence. Many of them coming with very, very little. This is not the immigrants you want in a classical government kind of way, right? You want immigrants that show up with nice big bank accounts. You want immigrants who show up that already have property or already have connections or other things, or education. Many of these were showing up without those modern tools. And guess what, Israel, you're a new country, deal with it. On the other hand, this highlighted the need for Israel, because if Israel hadn't been there, where would these Jews have been able to go? Because no other country was going to take them in such large numbers. So one thing I want to point out as a little bit of an interest, of an aside, is if you look down at, my eyes are sideways, at Iran, you'll notice that the census that this data had was 1956, about 65,000, and in 1976, about 62,000. Wait a minute, it didn't go down all that much, right? That's because until the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Iran was an ally of the US and was an ally of Israel, right? We don't often think about Iran as being an ally, right? But the Shah, whom the British and the US put into power after the US and British overthrew their democracy, not really a bright point in Iran used to have a democracy, and American agents were worried that their democracy might become friendly with the Soviet Union. And so we changed their government for them. And we gave them the Shah. We gave them a king, our friend. Trust me, if you talk to Iranians, they will remind you of this, that they had a democracy, and we're the ones who broke it first. And when the Iranian Revolution began, they were trying to reclaim that, but then unfortunately, the radical Islamic group took over the revolution as it took over the country, and we've been left with a mess ever since. But that's why, at least until 1976, Iran was still a pretty good place. Not wonderful. There was still anti-Semitism and not so much fun, but it was still a relatively good place to be as a Jew. Since that time, and so the population numbers have gone down since then. Okay, so basic understanding of this part? Okay. But guess what? European Jews and Middle Eastern Jews always mix. It wasn't always a perfect match. The Ashkenazic and Sephardic, or Mizrahi, which is the Middle Eastern group, they didn't always see eye to eye. There were major cultural differences, and there were major religious differences in how the two different communities worked. Has lasted for decades. There's not much of it left, but in the early years of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Sephardic and Ashkenazic tension was very real in Israel. Part of this was because, as we talked about, the early Zionists and the early pioneers, the ones who built up the land at the very beginning, were mostly European. And then in 1948, they were mostly the ones fighting to keep Israel independent. And now, all of a sudden, the poor relatives are showing up who didn't help build the country, who didn't help defend the country. And although they were welcomed with sort of a, all right, we'll take care of you, right? I understand you haven't had the Enlightenment, the Haskalah, right? You don't know about modernity and science and all of this because you come from Algeria, you come from Morocco, and there was a real attitude of patronizing and condescending from many of the Ashkenazim towards the Sephardim and the Mizrahi, both because of the economy and also because of the culture. And they were looked down upon. And you'll see that the early governments of Israel are dominated by the Ashkenazim, the people who are actually the prime minister and the ministers and all are Ashkenazim for decades because of this mix. However, it did infuse Israel with new culture and new life, and it did drastically improve the lives who were now coming to Israel. Both the Jews who were coming from Europe, who had a much larger population to work with and support the country, but it also dramatically improved the lives of the Sephardim who were coming to the land of Israel, who in a very short time were fully integrated and part of Israeli society. They were going to school, they were going to university, they were getting jobs, they were becoming professors and doctors and all the other things that you might hope for. And most of them had much better lives after the transition than they had had in the Middle Eastern countries prior to that. This is a very important point to keep in mind, however, when we get to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict later on in our discussion tonight. Because one of the big issues in the Palestinian conflict is the status of Palestinian refugees who were in Israel and left during the War of Independence and now would like to come home, as it were. And those people and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren have been kept in refugee camps, both in the West Bank, but also in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and other Middle Eastern countries. And they have been kept kind of like prisoners by those countries as refugees. So we had a similar number of people who came to Israel as refugees, and we made them part of the country. The Palestinians, on the other hand, still remain separate from the countries that they are in, and they are the only refugee people in the world that get an entire UN department devoted to them. All the other refugees have to share one UN department, and they get their own UN department. We'll talk about that more later. Okay. Early on, Israel was a heavily socialist country. Again, you might remember from last week, many of those early pioneers that were coming from Israel were not coming with their hand. Some of them didn't even have a copy of the Bible. Many of them were coming with a copy of Karl Marx. They were coming with copies of anti-capitalist ideas. They believed very much, and they believed Jewishly as well, that we needed to build a fair society, an equal society where everyone should be taken care of, and that the government had a huge role in organizing the nation, because you needed strong government control to organize a whole new country and to build all of the industry from nothing, because there was very little industry in the country when it started. Ideology. And one of the ways that you know that this was very heavily socialist was because by 1970, about 70% of the people got their paycheck in one way or another from the government. Think about that for a minute. Like, imagine if in the United States that 70% of the people worked either directly or just like as part of a government company, just one step away from being, you know, in the post office. You're also getting your paycheck from the US government. Not quite like that in our country. And this is going to change eventually, but in the 80s. But it does still reflect part of what Israel is today, which has universal health care, which has pensions for the elderly. It has very generous child support and assistance programs, and many other forms of social welfare. The economy has completely changed to be much more capitalistic since the mid-80s, but the social programs do still exist. So if you're thinking of going to Israel and getting a job with the government, those days are done. But it's important to remember that that was part of the early history of Israel. Okay. The government. You need to understand this for today. Now, I'm not going to explain to you every change in Israeli government over time, because Israel doesn't have a constitution. Right? The United States, we have a constitution. We have a document that gives the basic rules for how the government works. Israel. Right? Israel has instead a collection of basic laws and a collection of current rules, and they can change them, and they have changed them many times. It's always exciting to be a political scientist in Israel, because you never know. Next year we could have a president, next year a prime minister. Well, we'll keep changing. So I'm just going to explain to you the basic of the government for now, because that's the most useful to you. Issues of this style of government, the benefits and the disadvantages, have been the same for most of Israel's history. So right now, the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, the Israeli Congress, has 120 seats. And there are no districts. It's not like, you know, this part of Orlando is voting to send someone to the House of Representatives. It's not like that. The whole country votes, and you have political parties. If the political party gets 40% of the vote, they get 40% of the seats. It's just straight proportional representation. So if somebody got 50% of the votes, they would get 60 seats in the parliament. Make sense? And whoever has a majority, if you have 61 seats, then the leader of your group, your party, becomes prime minister. Pretty simple and straightforward, right? Yeah. Except there has not been any one party that has gotten a majority in a very long time, which means that no one gets 61 seats. Instead, if you look at the bottom, this is the current government. You have to make a coalition. You have to make a group of different political parties to more than 60 seats. So right now, Likud, which is the current largest group in Israel, their leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, is prime minister, but they only got 30 seats. Right? So they only got 30 seats out of the entire election. What's that?
Have a little more. Those,
yes, yeah, I think the current coalition is like 66 or something.
Yeah, that's about right. That's the coalition.
So
there are other parties.
Well, there are other parties, but this is the current majority. This is the current coalition. Yes, there are many other parties, but I ran out of room. But I wanted to show you that they have 30 seats. Kulanu has 10 seats. Beit Yehudi has 8 seats. Shas has 7 seats. United Torah Judaism has 6. Sephardic ultra-religious group, and United Torah Judaism is an Ashkenazic ultra-religious group. And then Yisrael Beitenu has 5 seats. So altogether, they have, I believe, 66 seats. And they are the coalition, which means if Netanyahu, the prime minister, wants to make a new law, they all have to agree. If one of these groups says, I don't like that new law, then you have to have a new election. If they leave the coalition, then you can get a new election tomorrow. In fact, recently there were some issues that it was looking a little shaky. It looks like it's settled down again, which it usually has, but it could have broken and then there'd be a whole new election. Which makes it challenging for most of Israel's history. Because no one group ever has a single majority behind one party, it means there's always a blend of ideas and opinions, and sometimes opposite opinions. So, you know, there are issues that disagrees with these two parties all the time and thinks that it's unfair what they're doing and they don't like what they're doing. But Netanyahu has to try and make them all happy just enough to make it till next week. And then a new problem comes up and you have to make them all happy to get to the next week. And that makes Israeli politics really exciting. Now, coalitions usually, of course, will share enough that they will not always be fighting. But there is always going to be some fighting from time to time. And this has been a feature of Israeli politics since the beginning, this coalition style governing. Because, you know, it's hard to get all the Jews to agree. So we each find our favorite party, we vote for it, and then we let the government do what the government does. Questions on this? Right? It feels crazy for us Americans, I know. It's a little crazy even compared to other parliamentary systems. Part of it is because they even up the level. You only need, I believe, at the moment, 4% to get a seat. If you get 4% of the vote, then you can start getting seats in the Knesset. And getting 4% of the population to vote for you is not that hard, because you can get small groups to vote for any crazy idea. Just like, what was it in New York, the rents are too high party, right? Yeah. So you can get people to vote. In England, they have the Raving Loony Party. Literally, that is the name of a political party in England, and they run candidates, and they get 4% easy in many votes. They would have seats in the Knesset if they were in Israel. There are some people in the Knesset who are raving loonies, but that's a whole nother conversation. Okay, so let's get back to the events, the major milestones of action that happen. Unfortunately, many of the major events in Israeli history are wars. So if this feels like a list of wars, there's kind of a reason for that. There are wars, and then recovery from wars, and preparations for the next war. And in between, you try to build a country. But the wars do create pretty strong landmarks in the history of the 20th century. So the first war after 1948 was in 1956. Not that long. And this was called the Suez War, or the Suez Crisis, or any other name that you might like. The basic feature of the war was Israel attacked Egypt to gain access to the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Eilat, also known as the Gulf of Aqaba. I'm trying to remember, did I put the map in? No, that's the Six-Day War. All right, so hopefully you have a good mental map of Israel, right? I don't have my whiteboard too handy. So you've got Israel here, and Israel at the bottom. There's the Sinai Peninsula between it and Egypt. Everyone with me? And Egypt has the Suez Canal that allows trade to go from the Indian Ocean into the Mediterranean Ocean. Good so far? Egypt, which was not a good friend of Israel in this time, said Israeli ships can no longer go through the Suez Canal, and ships going to Israel can no longer go through the Suez Canal. Plus, at that bottom point of the Gulf of Aqaba, the Gulf of Eilat, which is between the Sinai and Saudi Arabia, there's a little waterway. It's the opposite piece to the Red Sea. From now on, Israeli ships cannot go through that waterway, that they're not allowed to go through. And Israel said, but we kind of sort of need to. We kind of want to. And Egypt said no. Now, this was not the only thing that was going on that caused the war. That is the most obvious cause, because Israel was now going to have no way to get access from its major oil supplier, which was Iran. And that was a problem for Israel. So what else was going on was an Egyptian uprising had put a man by the name of Nasser in power, and Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, up until this point, was basically owned and controlled by the French and British. Remember those good colonial powers that we keep talking about. And the Egyptians had decided that they did not want the French and the British to still be in control of this. I mean, there was a lease, there were agreements, there were contracts, all that kind of stuff. And Egypt said, we're tearing it up. We're in charge of this from now on. Now, England and France were very upset about this, because that meant that for their own trade, they were worried they would not have access through the Suez Canal. And if you imagine cutting Europe off from the rest of the world, that's kind of a very big deal. So, keep my English right. England and France worked out an agreement with Israel that Israel would lead the charge, Israel would make the attack, and England would support Israel in order to retake the Suez Canal, and then they would be the ones who would keep it open for everybody. So this was a British-French plan to try and use Israel, essentially, get back control of the canal, which would benefit Europe and which would benefit Israel. The other thing this would also benefit was that Nasser had begun importing arms from the Soviet Union. And this had begun a major arms race. The world powers had been trying to make agreements to keep the weapons from not flooding into the Middle East. Nasser broke that agreement and went around all the way to the Soviet Union. Also needs people to supply it. And so Israel was interested in using British and French weapons, because the US was not selling yet in the numbers that it needed. And so they felt that they kind of needed to do this in order to secure themselves. This also was an opportunity for Nasser, the leader of Egypt, to show that he was going to be the most important person in the Arab world, that he was going to be the one to stand up to Israel. Israel did great during the war. They swept in, they went right up to the Suez Canal. The British and the French said, oh no, we need to help make sure this stays open. And everything was going fine until President Eisenhower said, what are you doing? I told you people not to go to war over this. I told you that we did not need a war. I'm getting ready for another election year. And Eisenhower is calling right now. So Eisenhower came out very strongly against the Israeli attack, and very strongly against the British and French string pulling, and essentially put everything back the way it was. Israel was still guaranteed right of access through the Suez Canal, but as we're going to see, that was kind of an on and off again. It was not steady after this. But that was pretty much the 1956 episode. Pretty clear? Yeah. Now, after this, before I go to the next slide, after this, everything went back to normal and it was all perfect, right? No, of course not. After this, from Egypt in particular, but also from Jordan, which remember is in control of the West Bank, and also from the other countries, there are raids and attacks that are coming across the border. They are sending what we would probably call a commando, but they weren't that skilled. They were terrorists that would sneak into Israel, and they would attack people, usually civilians, and try to Israel's will to continue going on. And this was going on for a decade. And Israel got better security and tried to stop, but these things were still happening. And one problem in particular was an area of Israel known as the Golan Heights. And that I'm going to need a picture for. So the Golan Heights is near the Sea of Galilee, which is up in the north of Israel. And at this time, the Golan Heights are part of the country of Syria. And what would happen is the Syrians up here, which is 2,300 feet above where the Israeli settlements are, would have their mortars and their cannons, and they would boom, shoot down into the area of Israel. And this area of Israel, the Galil, is a huge population center, and it is a huge agricultural center. Most of the time when you see pictures of the kibbutzim and things like that, it's in this area. This was not acceptable. The bomb falls in the middle of a desert. It's another thing when the bomb falls in like the middle of Iowa. That's kind of a big deal. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these shots are just being fired in. There are towns that are having to be evacuated, people living most of their life in bomb shelters, because this was just a daily occurrence. And this was something that the rest of the world was not able to convince Syria to stop. I mean, a lot of times they would shake a finger and say, no, you shouldn't do that. But there was no help from the rest of the world. Okay, so we have attacks from the Golan. We have attacks from Egypt happening. We then see in 1967 that the Arab forces are starting to get their armies ready and moving them into attack position in the Sinai Peninsula and the West Bank, in Syria and Lebanon, that they're getting ready. It's kind of like if you know, American football, when you see the people lining up on the line of scrimmage, you know what's coming next, right? Eventually someone's going to hike the ball and you're going to be fighting. And this is what Israel was seeing. Egypt had also ordered the troops from the United Nations to get out of the Sinai. The UN had peacekeeping troops in the Sinai, and it was their job to try to watch to make sure that there would be peace. Get out. Which is kind of a pretty clear signal that they're about to launch a war. And they also closed off Tehran again so that we could no longer get oil from Iran. So again, that's the Gulf of Aqaba. So with Jordan and Iraq joining the defense pact, Israel had to act. And Israel did. And it's called the Six-Day War for a reason. Because in 6 days, Israel had devastated the Arab armies so much, it would have captured Cairo, Damascus, and Amman, the capitals of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Their use of air power in particular was unprecedented. People still study the Six-Day War as an example of how to wage a war. They totally destroyed the air forces of the Egyptian and other Arab nations on the ground, and then used air support to help reinforce the tanks as they just raced across the whole territories to secure all of these frontiers. But Israel wasn't trying to capture Cairo, Damascus, and Amman. It wasn't trying to build a new empire. It was trying to push back the aggression, because when the country was so small, it meant that people could attack from anywhere very, very easily. We're going to see more about that when we talk about the later peace efforts. And this meant that, as a result, so the dark is where Israel was at the start of 1967, and everything that's shaded in is after the Six-Day War. Right, so Israel went all the way up to the edge of the Suez Canal. Again, it could have kept going, but it stopped there by its own choice. Hold everything in the West Bank. Again, it could have kept going across the Jordan River, but chose not to. And Israel took the Golan Heights, this area up here, and again, could have kept going up to Damascus, but chose to stop. They were trying to push back the edges that had been used as attack points all during those years. And this was hopefully going to make it safer to live in Israel. So Israel now controls Gaza and the Sinai. It has the West Bank. It also has East Jerusalem. If you zoom in on Jerusalem, remember we talked about in 48, the fighting stopped at the dividing line between the new city and the old city. Now all of Jerusalem is in Israel control. Israel now picks up about 750,000 or more people that are not Israeli citizens. what we now call Palestinians, were now added to Israel's area of control. And in total, its just geography was tripled. The amount of land that Israel now had in its control was 3 times more than it had been at the start. And the attacks went on. Now, the attacks were much less dangerous because if Egyptians are trying to sneak in here, they have a long way to go before they get to Israel. And the same thing across the Jordanian side, and the same thing across from the Golan. But this did not bring anybody to the negotiating table. Israel said very clearly, and we'll see later on in the 70s, meant it, that it was willing to give back the land in order to have peace. But until it had peace, it was not willing to give up this land, which it was using as a buffer, as a wall to defend its country. All right, we got 20 minutes left. Crazy. All right, let's move ahead then to 1973. And like I said, in between all of this is recovering from the war and preparing for the next one. 1973, the Yom Kippur War. It's called the Yom Kippur War because it starts on Yom Kippur. There had been many false alarms, many attempts to make Israel jump the gun. And finally on Yom Kippur, the Arab armies attacked. And in some ways, Israel was caught by surprise. They did not believe there was going to be an attack right then. They thought an attack might come soon, but they did not pick Yom Kippur. And this made Yom Kippur one of the hardest wars for Israel to fight. And it's one of the deadliest wars for Israel. Israel also had to fight against new Soviet technology. They had given much better air defense systems to the Arab nations. Israel had to relearn how to regain its power in the air over the Arab armies, which they did and were eventually able to push back. But at the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, it was very, very, what we could say, touch and go. In the early days of the war, it was not clear if Israel was going to survive. There was even been speculation since then of whether Israel had mobilized its nuclear arsenal, thinking that the war was that dangerous. And unfortunately, during those early days, when Israel was really being pressed so hard, international calls for everyone to stop. There was no international calls for a ceasefire. Once Israel began to push back, now there's a ceasefire call, right? And now it's a draw. And that did happen mostly because the Soviet Union was getting in the position to rearm their allies, and the U.S. was going to be drawn into rearming Israel, which could end the U.S. versus the Soviet Union in a full war. And so the decision was, all right, we'll stop. Now, you might be wondering, many other people have asked, why after 67, and then again after Yom Kippur, why didn't Israel just give back the land that it had taken from the last war? Right? Why not give back the Sinai and the West Bank and say, shame on you for attacking me, don't do it again? Right? And the answer is pretty obvious, which is if there had not been any benefit to Israel in terms of its security, then Israel would have been no better off despite the cost of the war in human life. Additionally, if the countries that had attacked were no worse off, there would be no reason why they wouldn't attack again, right? It's like, imagine you're going to Las Vegas and you're getting ready to play blackjack, and you put down your money and you play and you lose. And the dealer says, oh, that's okay, just you can have your money back. Yeah, I want to play at that table. If I win, I win, and if I lose, I don't lose anything. That's the best place to be. And Israel was not ready to reward the Arab world with that kind of deal. They were basically saying, look, we're going to hold on to this. We'll give it back, but you have to stop trying to kill us. When you stop, you can have it. Until then, we're going to keep hold of this. Right? It's like the kid trashes the car. You don't give him the keys again. Right? You make sure the kid is not going to do it before you hand him the keys to the car another time. 1973, this war was a huge moment in Israeli history, not just because it was so hard fought, but because it shook Israel's confidence. After the Six-Day War, you cannot believe how confident Israel was and how confident the Jews around the world were. I mean, it was a miracle, the Six-Day War. And just a few short years later, Israel has another victory, but a much harder victory. Israel was beginning to go, okay, well, maybe we're not always going to win so easily. Maybe this is not going to be just, a slam dunk. But it also meant that Israel's leaders, who had been so good, and their generals, who had been so flawless, were coming under heavier scrutiny. So the prime minister, Golan Heights, she eventually has to resign, and there are other changes happening in Israel. One of the big ones was the end of socialism. This came about almost as a direct result of the Yom Kippur War, partly because it shook their confidence, but also because it shook the world economy. Anybody here remember the 1970s? You remember gas lines in the US? No, not some of you are just too young. Anybody here ever seen a video of the gas lines in the US? And remember when we had this thing called inflation and all of that, right? Well, in Israel, it was worse. And that meant that the Israeli economy, which was already difficult under the socialism that it had, became almost impossible. And so there was a new push for new leadership. And that was when Likud first came to power and first got the prime ministership and became the new leader. And they pushed through a lot of changes. So one of the changes they did was to privatize the government companies. So rather than working for a company that was owned by the government, they sold the company, and now you work for a private industry. And that forced the companies to be more competitive. It forced the companies to compete on the global market. They also opened up the global market, especially the currency and financial markets, which, again, allowed for much more private wealth and much more private entrepreneurship of investment and growth. And over the next decade or so, this completely reshaped the Israeli economy. And the socialism of the the 40s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s is now a thing of the past. Again, the healthcare is still there, and the other elements of the socialism are still there for the safety net. But as far as the government controlling the economy, that is all gone. One of the things that helped it go was the fact that there was this enormous technology boom beginning in the 80s. A leader now in technology ever since. And we're going to talk about that more. But first, we have to talk about something else that happened in the 70s, and that's called Camp David. Camp David is the presidential retreat in the United States. And in the 1970s, President Carter got Sadat, who was the new leader of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, who was the leader of Israel, to come and sit down and have a peace negotiation. And out of Camp David came a peace agreement. One part was supposed to deal with a peace and statehood for the Palestinians, which the Palestinians rejected, not been invited to the negotiations, and they did not like Egypt making deals for them. Remember, Egypt saw itself as the leader of the Arab world. Not everyone agreed. In fact, not anyone outside of Egypt agreed. And they also didn't agree because they still wanted the real victory, which was all of Israel, not part. The other part that was more successful was the direct peace deal between Israel and Egypt. And the agreement was that Israel would give back the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt would stop trying to kill Israel. That was the deal. And it's what we call the land for peace arrangement. Right? We give you the land, you give us not being shot at. And that agreement has stuck all the way till today. And that agreement made a huge difference in all of the years that came afterwards, because Egypt, if you were paying attention, was always a major military power, if not the major military power in the Arab armies. With Egypt out of the war, with Egypt no longer being the leader of this military attacks, the other countries were not in a position to think they could take Israel on their own. It's sort of like, if they couldn't win with Egypt, out Egypt. and that meant that the open, full-on wars that Israel had been fighting, that era came to an end. Not that the fighting was done. We're going to talk about. Unfortunately, Sadat was killed by his own people because of what he did. He was assassinated for making this peace deal. But the man who took over after him, Mubarak, kept the deal, and that is what allowed Israel to enjoy many years of relative peace without the outright war of 56, 67, and 73, or 48 for that matter. Quite a lot of information, but but what Israel got instead was more and more terrorism. Remember, this began way back in the beginning. There was already terrorism before Israel became a country, and terrorism became more and more important. But the Arab League in 1964 created an organization called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And the PLO was dedicated to destroy Israel and to make it a Palestinian country. Yasser Arafat was the leader of that organization. Just between September and December of '67, he helped organize 61 attacks against Israel. He was busy. In 1968 was the first hijacking. Again, those of you old enough to remember or young enough to at least seen documentaries may remember that there was a time when hijacking was very common. Planes were being hijacked all the time. Boats were being hijacked, and buses were being hijacked or held hostage. Hostages were being taken. This was invented during this era as a way of gaining political leverage, political notoriety, and continuing the fight. Just by way of, you might be interested to know, Hezbollah was formed in Lebanon in '85. We're going to get to Lebanon, I hope. And Hamas was founded in 1987, both of which are other terrorist organizations with similar plans and similar styles to the PLO. Question?
One thing that's missing.
Well, there's lots that's missing.
One important thing
Yeah.
is the Olympics when 72.
Yes. Among the more famous events was the PLO carrying out the Munich massacre during the Munich Olympics in 1972, when the Israeli athletic team was taken hostage or killed. As other very famous things as well was the hijacking that took the plane to Entebbe, where Israel sent in their commandos to rescue the passengers and retrieve them. Right, the brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, Yonatan Netanyahu, was the only person who was killed during that raid, the only Israeli or passenger that raid.
How are these not acts of war?
Okay, so this is what's going to become an issue, especially as we get more and more into the Palestinian conflict, which is, what flag do they have? Where's their state capital? Who's their government?
But they can bomb their weaponry.
Well, and Israel did, right? And Israel carried out reprisals and retaliations and strikes to try and limit their ability. But if you have an organization whose members are just, in quotes, civilians, and there is no official government and there is no official state, then who declared war? There was no country of Palestine to declare war in Israel. These people did not represent Palestine because they were not elected by the Palestinians, nor was there even an official place that they met where the Palestinians could say yay. So there was no official state, therefore it doesn't count as war. And that was something that the Palestinians have used very much to their advantage. Because if you have a country that has gone to war, then it makes it much easier for a country to retaliate. You only have to compare the ability of the U.S. to go after the Taliban in Afghanistan as opposed to actually stopping terrorism. Right? We can invade and conquer Afghanistan. That's a piece of land. It's territory on a map. We know what to do with that. But how do you get rid of the idea of trying to kill people? How do you get rid of the knowledge of how to make bombs, of how to hijack planes, of how to do these things? That is much harder to target because it's not a state feature.
Isn't your intelligence, once you find out where they are, don't you?
Israel would and did. Israel targeted and assassinated numerous terrorist leaders, and they were able to get tips and stop terrorists from carrying out their plans in many, many cases. But it became almost more like a police action than a full war action, because you didn't have tank versus tank. And tanks are really not effective at stopping terrorists, right? Tanks control territory, but tanks can't find out who in this town is making bombs in the basement. The tank's not very good for that. And so this meant that Israel has had to completely reshape and relearn how to deal with its enemies, since their enemies were no longer wearing uniforms and no longer riding around in tanks and planes like Israel's army. And that has been something that will lead us into Lebanon. Remember I said like the major wars were basically done? The exception, and also kind of not. So the PLO tried to overthrow Jordan, talking about biting the hand that feeds you. So the PLO had many of their people in Jordan, living in Jordan. Jordan is the country that has the largest number of Palestinian residents, not citizens. And in 1970, the PLO tried to have a coup. They tried to get rid of the current king of Jordan, and they lost. And Jordan wasn't very kind. Jordan went after the PLO brutally, just massacring so many of their leaders. It was called Black September in their retaliation against the PLO. And the PLO had to leave because staying in Jordan was no longer a good idea. And they relocated to Lebanon. And then from Lebanon, they began to attack Israel. Now, Israel would try to retaliate across the border to the best of their ability. But then Lebanon had a civil war in 1975. Up until this point, although Lebanon was certainly not an ally of Israel, Lebanon was a very complicated and diverse country. It had a very mixed Muslim, Christian, and etc. population. You can look it up more detail, please do. That had given it a different style of life than many of the other countries. Unfortunately, that diversity broke apart in 75, and the different groups within Lebanon began fighting each other. And Israel saw this as an opportunity to go after the PLO. The PLO saw this as an opportunity to go after Israel. And by 1978, Israel decides they need to invade in order to stop what the PLO is doing from the south of Lebanon. And so Israel goes in heavily. And then in 1982, Israel, who is still in Lebanon, goes up to attacking Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, to try and really get the PLO out. They succeed eventually. The PLO goes to Tunisia, and then Israel stays in southern Lebanon until the year 2000. The Litani River, right here, and going up like that, that was more or less the area that Israel controlled during that period. So from basically 1978 until the year 2000, Israel was in control of this area of Lebanon. So it wasn't, again, like a full war in the sense that it wasn't tanks on both sides, but it was definitely a war in the sense that your soldiers were going off to fight and they were being attacked by people. Many of them, unfortunately, did not come home. So it was an asymmetrical war. Some people refer to Lebanon as Israel's Vietnam, in the sense that you have an army trying to stop a terrorist group, an insurgency. It's not exactly a perfect comparison, but it gives you some idea of what the structure was like. And this then became something that Israel had to try and work with for the next 22 years to try and prevent. Because again, if Israel retreats, then the attacks are happening on Israel. With this area here, there's a buffer. And just like with the West Bank and the Sinai, that was what Israel needed, was a buffer so its own people would not come under constant attack. Because when the PLO was in this area, well, I mean, you can see there are towns all along the border here and down here, but one finger is basically 1 mile. So you're talking 2 miles between their town, our town. And not very hard to kill someone from 2 miles away nowadays. So this was not a good situation. Okay, well, let's talk about things that were good as I try to cram this in. So Innovation Nation is a nickname for Israel. Israel is second in the world for population percentage with college degrees. The software industry took off in the 80s. Israel is a leader in agriculture, military, medical, robotic, and computer innovation. Israel is usually in the top 2 or 3 countries to file patents in the United States of foreign countries. And Israel is ranked number 10 in the Bloomberg Innovation Report of 2017, ahead of the UK, China, Canada, France, Norway, and of course, everyone else. But these were countries that you might think would be doing more innovating and be better. But no, little tiny Israel is ahead of all of these countries as far as the developments, advances, and science and other things that it comes up with every year. It is incredible what this little tiny speck on the globe is able to accomplish, especially given that it's accomplishing all of this while also dealing with all of the military issues that we've been covering. Okay, how are we doing? Okay. Well, we're not doing so well, because now we're back to the first Intifada. Okay, so things settle down in Lebanon. Israel is still there. They are controlling the southern area, but it's not an open war. It's just a slow simmer. However, in the West Bank, there is growing frustration among the Palestinians. They have seen the Arab world pull back from directly supporting their cause. Remember, they weren't happy with the Camp David Accords that the Egyptians did. Really happy when the Jordanians kicked them out. They're not very happy that they had to leave Lebanon. It's not been great for them. And they're also looking around saying, well, wait a minute, it's been 20 years since Israel took the West Bank and Gaza. Now, Israel has been saying for this entire time, you'll get your country as soon as you stop trying to kill us, and as soon as we can get an agreement that there's not going to be war, and as soon as you agree that we can also be here, but that really wasn't being felt by the average Palestinian. And so there's an eruption of violence that happens beginning in 87, really going strong until 91, and then tapering off after Madrid. There was a peace conference, and then even more in 93 when we get up to the Oslo Accords, which we'll hopefully talk about. One of the things that made this very, very different was you have a large number of non-uniformed casualties. The Palestinians at this point have worked out that they are not going to defeat Israel by themselves. They're not going to defeat Israel with the Arab armies, because the Arab armies don't seem to want to do this anymore, and they weren't very good at it anyway. So what they need is the world to pressure Israel, the same way that the world has pressured other countries to give up colonial territories or to give more human rights. They want the rest of the world to pressure Israel. And so it becomes very important that as they are protesting and attacking Israel, are seen as being civilian, as being innocent bystanders. So the idea is you attack with usually no open weapons. Maybe you have a few people in the back fire a few shots. And then when Israel retaliates, those that die will just look like regular teenage kids or young adults, and you now have your picture that you can put into the publicity. And you can say, look, 2,000 people, 2,000 casualties were killed during this time, or 2,000 civilians were killed, when the majority of them, by later accounts, were very clearly not civilians. These were not just people walking across the street who happened to be hit. These are people who were part of violent protests that Israel fought back against, and unfortunately had to kill the people that were involved. However, in the long term, it's the legacy after this first Intifada that creates bitterness and anger, because whether you agree with a real assessment of they were fighters, they weren't fighters, they were civilian, they were combatant, it doesn't matter. If your kid is dead, if your brother is dead, if your father is dead, you grow up being angry at Israel. And that goes right into your blood. And if you were an Israeli, you grow up knowing that these people over and over and over again just keep chanting they want to kill you. Even when they can't win, they just keep saying they want to kill you. And that creates a lasting bitterness between the two sides. In 1993, Bill Clinton arranged for Yasser Arafat, first leader of the PLO, and Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister of Israel at the time, and to begin to negotiate a long-term solution. And this was called the Oslo Accords. The basic plan was that the Palestinians would recognize Israel's right to exist, that Israel would recognize the Palestinians having legitimate political rights, and there would be a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces, and there would be the creation of a Palestinian government. The last two happened. I mean to say, without any doubt. That's where the Palestinian Authority, which is still in power, is. It was voted into power. There has not been an election since, except for Gaza, when Gaza finally also had its election, when they voted in Hamas, and there has been no election since. And Israel has withdrawn many of its troops from different zones of the West Bank. We'll leave Gaza for another time. The Palestinians did, in some manners, recognize Israel's right to exist, and with retractions and with disruptions. Likewise, Israel, while recognizing and stating that they want a two-state solution, that there should be a Palestinian state, has always left it very ambiguous, because they're waiting for the negotiation, what that will exactly be like. How much sovereignty will that state have? How much autonomy will that state have? And we'll come back to some of those sticking points as I rush through. The reason why, oh, I left a thing from the Greeks. Look at that. That's what happens when you recycle slides. One of the reasons why Israel is reluctant to simply retreat from all of the West Bank is, if you are living in the West Bank, this dark area is where you can hit with just a regular mortar, which are very simple too, right? That's only a 6.5 mile range. So pretty much the entirety of Israel's main population centers are reachable by a mortar shell, which can be fired and gone in an instant. And Israel wants to make sure that as it makes peace, to become a giant bullseye for all of these types of attacks. And obviously, when you have better and better rockets, then the range gets even worse, and all of the country is a target. Okay. However, following Oslo, there was movement for peace between Israel and Jordan. They agreed on water rights. They agreed to cooperate with regards to defense, that is to say, to prevent terrorist attacks that would disrupt the peace. Jordan retains the historic role in administering the Muslim, or the Muzzle sites in Jerusalem. That is why, strange as it may sound, Jordan is in control of the area of the Dome of the Rock. Actually have sovereignty over the Dome of the Rock. That is to say, it's not considered Jordanian territory, but they have authority over that area. So what they say matters on that spot, even though it's not part of their country. And that was part of the peace deal that was made in '94. Again, this made a huge difference in the whole calculation of the Israeli conflict. It also kind of upset the Palestinians again, because now they can begin to see more and more countries are normalizing the relationships with Israel. There are fewer and fewer that are willing to fight their wars for them. And so you end up with the second Intifada in 2000, roughly going to 2005. And this came about chronologically after the breakdown of Camp David in 2000. This was another attempt by Bill Clinton to move the peace process forward from Oslo and try to really finalize some details. Unfortunately, the Palestinians walked away from that negotiation being unwilling to compromise on any single point. And after they walked away, it happened that Ariel Sharon, who would later become prime minister, visited the Temple Mount, and this was used as a provocation for this new uprising. There are, however, many people who believe that the violence had been deliberately planned beforehand, that they were already preparing and were looking for the right opportunity. The idea that the Jews were going to take the Dome of the Rock was very convenient. And this allowed them to regain political capital after having completely failed to get anything in Camp David. And unfortunately, again, more people die. So what's left? We're not going to go into the later Hezbollah war. We're not going to go into the later Gaza war. We're not going to go into all the other conflicts since, because we're out of time, we're over time. But there are a number of points that you need to at least be aware of when people talk about the current situation in Israel. These are the outstanding issues between Israel and the Palestinians. One of them is the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. Why does Israel want to be recognized as a Jewish state? It's because of part number 2. Right? No one's asking the Palestinians to say Judaism is wonderful. That's not the issue. You may remember the whole issue, all these issues are really dating back more to a feeling of colonialism than religion. But part number 2, the Palestinians have argued that they deserve the right of return, meaning that the people, or in this case more likely the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of people who originally lived in Israel should be allowed to come back en masse to Israel, which would be approximately 4 million Palestinians, that they should have that right. And Israel is saying, no, we are not open to the idea of 4 million people coming. Israel has talked about compensation and talked about other forms of convincing people that this is not needed. The number of $30 billion was floated at some point, but the Palestinians continue to insist that they should be allowed to move back. When Israel says they want to remain a Jewish state, they are saying you don't get to bring 4 million people into our country, because then it would no longer be a Jewish state. It would now be a very mixed state, 50-50 at least, if not a Muslim majority. And then there would be a victory in a very different direction. Additionally, issues of control over Jerusalem, especially the old city, but also the eastern part of the city is a major topic. Israelis living over the Green Line, this is known as the settlement issue. There are 100,000, 200,000 Israelis now living across that line where the armistice was drawn in the occupied territory. The word disputed territory is more accurate by international law, but you'll hear the word occupied used most. The question of what happens to them. Israel has made it pretty clear that they are willing to dismantle all of the remote and isolated groups, settlements, but the areas right near the border of Israel that have the vast majority of the population, like 85% of the settler population lives on the border, they would like to incorporate into Israel and give equal land to the Palestinians from another part of Israel. So that's one of the big issues. The Palestinians, question of Palestinian sovereignty and autonomy is also rather big. So will they really be fully independent? Will they be in control of their own airspace? Will they be able to have their own army? Will they be able to, decide whatever they want about their own terrorists or people? Those are questions that Israel would like answers to. And that comes back to the final question of security, of how well is Israel able to guarantee the security of its citizens once a peace deal has been made? And as we've seen with Jordan, peace worked, and the violence from the states stopped. The Egyptian army and the Jordanian army have not attacked Israel since they made peace. But the non-state actors are the big issue now. The terrorists, the individuals who are carrying out these attacks. How can Israel make itself secure? Right now it has pretty good security relations with the Palestinian Authority. And they do share information about terrorists often. And the Palestinian Authority will often catch terrorists before they can attack Israel. The question is how to make that reliable and permanent so that Israel can sleep at night. Because at the moment, they feel they are safer being in control rather than letting that control go to someone else who still has not officially made it 100% clear that they are happy with Israel going on as Israel currently is. And that's where we are. Good night. And this, I hope you do remember, this is the surface layer, right? This is like tiny, tiny scratching, but at least it'll give you some of the framework, some of the history to understand the debates, the discussions, and to also be proud of what Israel has accomplished.